everybody. I'm back and you're back, and it's good to see everyone again. This is Jackie at Stitchhouse in Plano, Texas, and we're ready to do a series of videos on binding. And we're going to take it real slow. I want you to work along with me. You'll have homework to do after each of the 5 videos. We'll start with squaring up our quilts because that's important. We'll go into cutting the binding and joining the strips of binding. Backing up a minute, we'll even look at how to determine how much binding you need and how many strips you need to cut. We'll look at a couple of ways to cut accurately, cut those strips accurately. We'll look at pressing and sewing the binding on. And a very important feature, we'll be looking at mitering the corners. Mitered corners, nice mitered corners on a quilt are so important. We'll look at how to join the binding at your starting and stopping place. We'll look at a couple of ways to do that because sometimes you have just a short end. You might be putting binding on a pot holder or a cup mat, and you want to know how to join your end pieces there too. And then we'll look at some novelty bindings, a padded flanged binding and a mini piping binding. So that'll be over the course of about 4 weeks, 5 weeks actually. So stay with me, we'll go slow, you'll be able to do everything. And let me tell you one more thing, none of my work will be done by hand. So I do bindings completely by machine. You can adapt some of my techniques if you like to do handwork, but I don't do handwork, so I'll be showing you how to sew your binding entirely by machine. All right, looking forward to this. We'll get started right away. All right, so we're going to be using the binding tool to make a nice, even, perfectly aligned closure on our quilt binding. And remember that to use this tool you need to have exactly a 12-inch opening, and you need some good long tails, like 10-inch tails are best. All right, so what I'm going to do is start by placing the square end of the binding tool up against my starting point or stopping point, bringing the binding over the tool and then folding it back against this line right here. And I'm going to actually, I want to be accurate there, I'm actually going to make a little crease there because I need to mark that crease with a fabric marker. So I'm going to go to a real fabric marker this time. And I'm marking there, and let's just do the right angle of the ruler and mark all the way across there. So I've got a nice line, a nice washout line there. All right, so I was using my tool like so. I'm now going to rotate it 180 degrees and to the other end of the 12-inch opening, bring the binding over the tool, bring the binding to that mark right there and fold back and make a crease on that mark. And then open that up, and on the right side I'm going to draw a line to signify this line on the tool, and that line is at a right angle to the edges of my binding. All right, now I'm going to rotate my, no, I did rotate it. My tool was like this on this side. I'm going to come back over to the first side I worked on, and I'm going to align this line on my tool with the line that I've drawn on the fabric, and cut One of the nice things about this binding tool ruler is that it cuts off the dog ear at this corner, and then I cut that diagonal line. All right, like so. And then I'm going to rotate the tool 180 degrees again. And on this side, I find the line that I drew, which is right there. And this time I align point A, which is, you can see the A right there, the end of the ruler, the little dog ear end of the ruler, with the line that I've drawn on the right side of the fabric. I want to be sure everything is straight, and then we'll cut. This is where you need to be able to cut with both hands, and I'm not gifted that way. Oops. See, trying to cut upside and backwards is not an easy thing. Alright, so there you have your two diagonal ends. Let's get these cutaway pieces out of the way. Now we're going to bring those two diagonal edges together. And this is one place where you do want to sew a 1/4 inch seam. So I will take a couple of pins and pin that together. And then when we open that back up, it's going to fit very nicely to finish out the quilt. Let's take that to the sewing machine. Now it's ready to sew. So the leader cloth is there. Let me get my seam where I can sew it. And I'm going to be sewing from this corner with a 1/4 inch seam down to here. And everything aligns beautifully because you were able to cut off the dog ears. Get rid of my leader cloth. Press that seam open. I'll finger press it first and then find my roly press tool. And now that is ready to finish sewing onto the back or the front, whichever you're doing, the front of your quilt. And you have a beautiful closure there. Do you like that? But you know what? I really would prefer my walking foot for that. So let's switch back to the walking foot. And I'll just move a little bit past where I finished sewing before. Again, I'm watching the guiding point on my presser foot. It's a little mark on the front of the presser foot that allows me to sew a very precise 1/4 inch seam. And sewing past my previous stitching just a little bit. All right. Now I had previously pressed my binding away from the quilt, but I've got that little 12-inch area that needs to be pressed away. Then I'm ready to bring my binding to the right side. And we'll look at a couple of ways to sew the binding down. This is a place where you definitely want to use your clips that are so handy in place of pins. So a few of these along the way. All right, so now I have clipped the binding to the right side, On this small sample, I clipped all the way around. Sometimes I just clip along one side, and then when I'm ready, I clip ahead another couple of feet. Whatever works for you. I'm using the walking foot again, but I have changed out the sole of the walking foot. This is the sole that I was using. The needle opening is there, so it has this bar in front of it to hold my fabric down when I was sewing the 1/4 inch seam. But the sole that I have now has added a center guide to it, and I'm going to be guiding that center guide to the edge of my binding. So I'm going to come over here and place the edge of the binding against my center guide on the walking foot, and then I'm moving my needle position to the right of center so that I can stitch up on the binding to hold the binding in place. And the needle position that I use may vary a little bit from project to project, but it'll give me a nice straight row of stitching, edge stitching, really close to an edge. Can you see any of it coming out back there yet? I am sewing with black thread simply so you can see what I'm doing. Now I'm reaching the corner, and maybe back here I can show you how the corner needs to work. I bring the second side that I'm working on under, and then bring the side that I'm working on diagonally folded from the corner, wanting the edges of the binding to meet right there. So I do that as I go, and sometimes use my stylus to kind of hold things in place as I approach that corner. My center guide was interfering with the binding just a little bit, so I raised the presser foot to come up over the binding on the second side. Alright, so right at the diagonal, I'm going to raise the presser foot and turn so that I can sew the second side. Oh, look how even that stitching looks. Right, even though it's black stitching, it looks really very, very good. I'm pulling out the clips as I approach them. Now there's another stitch that you can use if you don't want to see the top stitching on your binding. Then you might consider using a stitch like this. So on my machine, this stitch is actually called the very overlock stitch, and I've set it at the widest width here. That's not the default setting on it. If I were going to use it to catch my binding, I would set it much more narrow and maybe even shorter. So here I've set my width at 1.8 and my length at 1.5. Down here I've shortened the length a little bit, and here I've made the width even more narrow. Now what this stitch is designed to do when we're sewing it on binding is to catch the edge of the binding with the little jump stitches. Alright, so each jump stitch catches the edge of the binding, and the straight stitching in between is sewn in the ditch or off the edge of the binding. And that works pretty well, especially if you use monofilament thread, at the very least matching thread, of course. But there's something that I don't like about this stitch, and that is that the jump stitch is open. That is, there's space between where the jump stitch begins and where it picks up again. And so if I'm trying to get the look of hand sewing, this stitch tends to depress the binding on the two sides of the jump stitch. And so my favorite stitch to use is one that you'll recognize as the blanket stitch. Yes, okay, so here's the blanket stitch on my machine, and I've got it set for a very wide setting right here. This is the stitch number, it's 1329. This is the stitch I was using, or no, this is another stitch entirely. Here I've mirror imaged the blanket stitch, and then I've started setting the blanket stitch down to where I can use it to catch my binding. So here I've set my width at 1.8 and my length at 3. And down here I've set my width at 1.5 and left my length at 3. So now using this stitch, this blanket stitch, each jump stitch is a closed stitch. That is, the needle comes over for the jump stitch to catch the binding and then comes back into the exact same position. So I feel that gives me a better look to a stitch that I'm trying to conceal. So I would normally use monofilament thread, and this is monofilament thread. Be sure when you use the monofilament thread that you're using a polyester monofilament. If you have a nylon monofilament at home, throw it away and replace it with a polyester monofilament. Nylon monofilament is really a pain, and you'll be breaking threads and saying words that you don't want to say. So normally I would put that on my machine in the vertical position because it's not cross wound. But let me choose my stitch now and get it set up. Okay, so I'm getting ready to use a stitch that I would normally sew with monofilament thread, a polyester monofilament thread. It's on my machine, it's number 1329, and it's actually a blanket stitch. On your machine you may even need to mirror image it to get the swing of the zigzag just going in the right direction. I'm sure you'll need to adjust your width and probably your length, and the length will affect how close the swing stitches are together, and the width will adjust how deeply you sew into the blanket stitch. You also can adjust your needle position. Now I'm going to sew a little ways and I'm going to let you look at what I'm doing, and then I'm going to try to adjust my width a little more narrow so that I can take a little less bite into the fabric. So you'll see some stuff that doesn't look very good at all at first where I was adjusting. And then when we get this out from under the walking foot, you'll be able to see what I'm doing now. And the straight stitches are sewn off the edge of the binding. And I'm accomplishing that by adjusting my needle position and guiding the edge of the binding against the center guide on the presser foot. All right, so there you can see that. Now, if I were sewing this with monofilament thread and didn't want it to look like a decorative stitch, I would adjust my stitch width more narrow and try to take just a tiny, tiny bite into the binding. Right now my width is set at 1.2. And if I had monofilament thread on there or even matching green thread, you would not see much of the stitching at all. All right, I'm approaching another corner and I have pre-folded it into place. I'm going to use my stylus to get everything lined up nicely. Then I can turn. Get that clip out of the way. So can you see the difference there and how much bite I'm taking in compared to right there? I might dare to go a little more narrow. Let's sew forward a little bit and then I'll see. So this is something, the settings that you use in your needle positions, these are things that you would want to work out on a sample. All right, so I've set my width at 1.1 now. And I'm still able to catch the edge of the binding. And I think this would be my preferred setting if I were doing this with monofilament thread and trying to get an invisible look to my binding. So either monofilament thread or matching thread. So just a tiny little bite into the fabric. Can you visualize how that would look? Okay, I think you have the feel. All right, so here's where I've been stitching with the blanket stitch, a very small version of it, and I've mirror imaged that blanket stitch on my machine so that the jump stitch that goes over into the binding goes in the right direction. The straight stitches of the blanket stitch are right along the edge of the binding. They're off the binding, the jump stitch goes into the binding. Now what I want actually is to take as small a bite into that binding as possible. Here my width is set at 1.5 and I'm going to start making it more narrow. Like right down here the width is set at about 1.2. And so you can see that I'm taking less of a bite into the binding. I'm sewing here with black thread so you can see exactly what's going on. And down here I set my width at 1.1. I might even be able to go down to about 1 on the width to take just a tiny bit of bite into the binding. I've got my machine set up now with the polyester monofilament thread, and I'm going to use it to sew a little bit along the opposite side. All right, so here I go. I'm sewing my blanket stitch, mirror imaged. I'm setting my width at, I'm going to try 1.1 again, but we may go more narrow if we can. So I want to take just a tiny bite into the binding when the needle swings to my right. I'm going to stop and look back here and see how that looks. Okay, I'm going to try setting my width at 1. I don't want to miss the edge of the binding, of course, so I have to be a little bit careful. If I go too narrow, then I might miss the edge of the binding. Tell you what, let's mark where I made that change, which was about right there, and then we'll look at it up close in just a minute. The only thing I don't like about using the blanket stitch to catch my binding like this is that it only has one straight stitch in between. So if I want more space between the jump stitches, the only thing I can do is lengthen my straight stitch, which is fine on a straight edge, but if I need to go around any curves or when I get to a corner, a longer straight stitch is kind of hard to maneuver the corner. But I was thinking this morning that I actually could take this stitch, this blanket stitch, this small version of it, into my stitch designer and add a second or third straight stitch in between the jump stitches. And then to me, that would be the ideal stitch to use with monofilament or matching thread to catch binding on the right side. All right, let's stop and see how that looks. All right, so down here is where I had my stitch set at 1.1. I made it more narrow, set it at 1.0 exactly, and I'm still catching the binding nicely. You know, I might even dare to go a little more narrow on it. But do you see how that looks? You barely see the stitching, and the less you can see of the stitching, the more comfortable you'll be with this, I think. I think you'll be proud of it when you can hide that stitching. I'm going to have to try taking this stitch into the stitch designer and adding a straight stitch in between the jump stitches. I think that would really enhance the stitch or the way I like to use this stitch for catching binding. All right, so that's our stopping place for today. You can finish the binding on your quilt, and then when we come back, we're going to do some really fun bindings, some variations of bindings that I think you'll like.